Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 29, Section 3. The title of it is Challenges and Changes in the Movement. Now, because of disagreements among various civil rights groups, particularly a rise to what was called black nationalism, not every civil rights group felt the need to segregate themselves from white America. But it is worth pointing out, and the focus of our lesson today is going to be on those who did choose to separate themselves. Not all black civil rights activists believed that equality was possible. Some saw history as a good proof of the fact that perhaps it wouldn't be reachable. And so some did believe in separating themselves, and the 1960s, sadly, were a violent period in the fight for civil rights as well. We've been talking about the fight to end segregation. And as we've talked about, the 1960s were a great period of progress and victory in regards to de jure segregation, meaning segregation by law. Unfortunately, however, de facto segregation, or segregation by custom or practice, was still very prevalent. Despite Brown v. Board, despite the Civil Rights Act of 1968, despite voting rights and the 1964 Civil Rights Act and all of these amazing laws and court cases, there still remains much work to be done, even today. Now, after the Second World War, as blacks were migrating to northern cities and whites were migrating out of northern cities, this led to a situation throughout many cities in America where the inner cities were dominated by African Americans. And those properties in which many African Americans were residing were owned by landlords, often white Americans living outside of the cities. And because of such a low tax base in these cities, and because of the crumbling infrastructure and the poorly funded social services, many of these slums, as they were called, were dilapidated, meaning substandard living conditions. Unemployment among the black community as of the end of the 1960s was twice as high as that of white Americans. And so many black Americans became angry, not just became, but the anger festered and has festered throughout because of what many have perceived as unfair treatment by white authority figures, including police officers. And so throughout the mid-1960s, we see numerous clashes between white authority figures and black civilians. Sadly, race riots were often the norm and not the exception. That's what makes Martin Luther King and his movement so incredible, is that he chose to remain nonviolent even though many became impatient with that strategy. And that's who we'll be talking about today, those who became impatient with the idea of nonviolence. Many whites were unable to understand why it is that African Americans were so angry. Many white Americans today misunderstand the Black Lives Matter movement and why African Americans could be so angry. Now, many blacks today and in the 1960s feel that equal opportunity in jobs may be legal by law, but is not happening in practice. Not if minority groups are experiencing this level of unemployment as opposed to white Americans. And also, sadly, the high ideals that we discussed in the War on Poverty are being diverted to make funding room for the Vietnam War. It's just a fact throughout American history that wars have diverted a country's attention from domestic policies to foreign aggressors. And so, brilliant, ambitious, hopeful domestic programs like the War on Poverty are sometimes not feasible during a war. What we're looking at here is an aerial photograph of Detroit during one of the worst race riots in American history. What we're looking at here are National Guardsmen being called into the city of L.A. in response to race riots following the death of Martin Luther King. There were riots in over 100 cities across the nation when Dr. King was assassinated. Not all blacks felt that Dr. King's dream would be possible. And so some, including members of the Nation of Islam, and that is a black nationalist movement, advocated a separation from white Americans, that whites and blacks should not mingle. The Nation of Islam preached that white Americans were the source of many of black people's problems historically, and that members of the Nation of Islam should seek separation and want nothing to do with white Americans. Perhaps their most vocal and confrontational leader is Malcolm X. Denzel Washington recently played Malcolm X, did an excellent job. I highly recommend it. He was a very controversial leader, even among his followers. He received a great deal of publicity for his inflammatory statements, for his arousal of anger among his followers. And he did manage to frighten people because, like John Brown, he was pointing out that peace was not possible and that violence perhaps was inevitable. Now, some resented this figure, and he did become divisive within his own community. Though later in Malcolm X's life, he traveled to Mecca, the capital of the Muslim faith, their second holiest city, actually their most holy city. And it is required of all Muslims at some point in their life to make a great Hajj or pilgrimage. It is one of their 5 pillars of faith. All Muslims must, if able, make a journey to the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And while there, they all wear white. They all circle the Dome of the Rock several times throughout the day. Hundreds of thousands of them gathered in the same place. They all pray peacefully. They all treat each other equally. They all wear the same simple clothing. And they all address each other as brother and sister while on this pilgrimage. And most Muslims point to this journey as one of the most important journeys in their life. And for Malcolm X, it certainly was the case. In fact, he had a pretty powerful experience while in Mecca. Because though he was filled with this anger towards white people because of their historic mistreatment of African Americans, while in Mecca, everyone treated each other equally. Everyone referred to each other as brother and sister. He walked and prayed with people of blonde hair, blue-eyed, pale skin. And then walked alongside other black Muslims and walked alongside people from all walks of life, from all over the world. And he came back with a completely different message, that perhaps whites and blacks could get along in the final analysis, and that instead of bullets, blacks should begin to reach for the ballot, pursuing the cause of voting to gain greater representation in our democracy. And he came back with an entirely different message. Well, Malcolm X's brand of anger and hatred that he had stirred up was not that easily settled. And eventually he was murdered by a member of his own group while giving a speech in 1965. The Nation of Islam was not the only group that disassociated itself with Dr. King's movement. Over time, the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee became more and more militant, while Dr. King's group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, continued to practice nonviolence. The head of the SNCC was a man named Stokely Carmichael. He began to urge his followers to use the phrase "Black Power," and whose symbol was a raised fist. And you can find photographs from the time, even recent photographs, where you'll find African Americans using the raised fist as a symbol. The idea of the Black Power movement was that blacks could control their own lives and communities and did not need the white man and did not want the white man in their lives. And one of the militant wings of the Black Power movement was a party known as the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were formed as a protective wing for the black community. It was their belief that the police discriminated, abused, and mishandled their powers, especially towards minorities. And so the Black Panthers did not want the police in their communities, did not trust the police. They believed they could protect and serve their own community. They also preached the ideas of Mao Zedong, ideas of communist collectivism, that the African Americans could take care of themselves by distributing resources and ensuring survival collectively. And often the Black Panthers did have violent confrontations with the police. They remain popular among the black community, but have to this day endured as controversial figures in the history of civil rights. In fact, another lesser-known figure that is not in your book, Charles Manson, when he began his string of murders, he always pinned the murders of white women on the Black Panthers. And then often he liked to murder police officers. And he would pin them on the Black Panthers. And then sometimes he would murder white women. But I already said that. Sometimes he would murder black women as well. And he would frame the police. His idea was to stir up what he called helter-skelter, what he believed to be an inevitable clash between the races. And so his killings were to provoke this violence.
Jenny and me was just like peas and carrots again. She showed me around and even introduced me to some of her new friends.
Shut that blonde man and get your white ass away from that window. Don't you know we in a war here?
Hey man, he's cool. He's cool. He's one of us.
Let me tell you about us.
What the hell?
Our purpose here is to protect our black leaders from the racial onslaught of the pig who wishes to brutalize our black leaders, rape our women, and destroy our black communities.
Who's the baby killer?
This is my good friend I told you about. This is Forrest Gump. Forrest, this is Wesley. Wesley and I live together in Berkeley, and he's the president of the Berkeley chapter of SDS.
Let me tell you something else. We are here to offer protection and help for all those who need our help. Because we, the Black Panthers, are against the war in Vietnam. Yes, we are against any war where black soldiers are sent to the front line to die for a country that hates them. Yes, we are against any war where black soldiers go to fight and come to be brutalized and killed in their own communities as they sleep in their beds at night. Yes, we are against all these racist and imperial dog acts.
shouldn't have brought you here. I should have known it was just going to be some bullshit hassle.
He should not be hitting you, Jenny.
Come on, Forrest.
Sorry I had a fight in the middle of your Black Panther party.
So, now we have to talk about a great tragedy. One of the most heroic figures in the civil rights movement, who always objected to the Black Power movement and its preaching of violence, who always taught compassion and equality and community, gave one last speech on April 3rd of 1968. And in this speech, he seemed to predict his own death, and he quoted the book of Exodus, and he said, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I have been shown the promised land, but I will not go with you." And on the very next morning in Memphis, Tennessee, James Earl Ray shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr. Now, meanwhile, Robert Kennedy was campaigning for president. The Democratic primaries were ongoing at that time. Robert Kennedy proved to be the strongest front runner at that time. And he was going to give a speech at a rally. And then Dr. King was killed. He was encouraged by his constituents to cancel the rally, though he persisted. In fact, he went on to speak at Martin Luther King's funeral. And I'll play the speech for you at the end of the lesson. But let me paraphrase. Robert Kennedy said, "When you teach a man to hate, when you teach a man that he is less or more than his brothers because of the color of his skin, you do not bring about unity. You teach only violence." And the mindless menace of violence in America today, it's a great tragedy. Robert Kennedy also went on to implore people to not react violently to this peaceful man's death. But in fact, his death led to the worst urban rioting in American history. Over 100 cities engulfed in flames in the days following his death. In fact, Robert Kennedy himself, who's another great hero of mine, was assassinated just 2 months later, right after speaking of the need of peace and brotherhood and the carrying on of Martin Luther King's legacy. And while accepting the Democratic nomination for the candidate for President of the United States in 1968, he was shot and killed by a Jordanian immigrant because of the U.S.'s support of Israel. These are violent times, ladies and gentlemen. Why all of this violence? Why all of this hatred? Well, Lyndon Johnson had the same question. In fact, he appointed a presidential commission to study the causes of urban violence. And in their 200,000-page deposition, of which I'll summarize, 200,000-page deposition. And it was called the Kerner Commission Reports. They named racism as the main cause of the tensions and violence of the 1960s. Now, I'm grossly oversimplifying here. They gave much more detail. There were some gains, many gains in the civil rights movement, even gains in the later part of the 1960s when things seemed dark. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in housing. As a result of the civil rights movement and equality and integration, more black students have been able to finish high school and go on to college and even get better jobs. Real progress has been made. African Americans have, through this experience, gained a greater pride in their racial identity and have demanded among many universities black studies programs. And so at many colleges you can take classes on African American history, black studies. We even have a Black History Month now. African Americans are more visible in pop culture. We see more blacks in movies and on television. We also see more blacks voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 led to an increase in voter registration. And this resulted in more black elected officials, in politicians having to consider the black vote, common topic of discussion in our ongoing presidential campaign, who are black Americans voting for, because now they're able to vote. And the legal barriers preventing Southern blacks from voting have been removed by law, and now federal officials register voters, not state officials. Yet there is much work to be done. The civil rights movement is not a thing of the 1960s. It's part of our lives today. In fact, perhaps because of the Vietnam War, perhaps because of the violence, and in many cases the forced busing of African Americans to facilitate integration as a result of Charlotte-Mecklenburg versus the United States. Yes, did you know that in Charlotte-Mecklenburg a case was taken to the Supreme Court because Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools did not want to have to go pick up black students and take them to white schools. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that, oh yes, you're going to go pick up black students and take them to white schools. Whites propagandized that idea and called it forced busing. But the continued discrimination, again, has been by custom, if not by law. White flight has reversed much of the progress towards school integration because communities tend to remain segregated even to this day. Unemployment and poverty among the black community remain significantly higher than that of white Americans. One effort to overcome this has been affirmative action, and that is that companies, especially those who deal with the federal government, have been expected to hire a certain amount of minorities and women in job positions as a result, in a hope to overcome years of discrimination. Some have criticized this policy as reverse discrimination, such as the Supreme Court of Back versus the University of Regents in California. This young man was attending a medical school he had applied for, and he had been denied entrance to the upper level of his medical school. He was a white American, white male, and he was able to demonstrate in the U.S. Supreme Court that they had chosen a black person who was less qualified than him to fulfill the requirements of affirmative action. He gained admittance to the school, and it set the precedent of the eventual reversal of affirmative action.